there, and a warm welcome to new FT audience members who are joining us from ft.com and from LinkedIn. Now, it will soon be time for me, Claire Barrett, to hand over to my colleagues in the US for the next part of the Global Boardroom Conference. Hannah Murphy, my colleague and the tech correspondent for the FT in San Francisco, is going to be anchoring the sessions from now until the end of today. But don't worry, I'll be back bright and early tomorrow in London to take over from then. Now, before Hannah takes over, we have one of the key debates of the day, Martin Wolf's panel of economists, who will be discussing how policymakers should tackle the crisis. Now, in a moment, I'll introduce our esteemed panel, but first, I'd like to take a moment to remind you about the interactive nature of these sessions, because of course, why let Martin Wolf ask the questions when you compose them yourself? Now, if you are on LinkedIn, you will see that there is a live chat where you can submit your thoughts and queries via the feed. And as you'll no doubt know by now, the Global Boardroom attendees can reach the panel via the moderator by using the chat function on the right of your screen and ask some questions there. And what a panel this promises to be. In our lineup today, we have Bill Dudley, the former president of the New York Fed, the chief economist of the OECD, Laurence Boone, Markus Schomer, the chief economist of global boardroom partner PineBridge Investments, and last but no means least, Carmen Reinhart, the chief economist of the World Bank. Oh, what a panel. The pulling power, of Mr. Wolf. Now, Carmen spoke on Martin Wolf's panel at the last Global Boardroom Conference back in May, before she took on her current role. So it will be interesting to see how her views might have changed. So hold tight. Martin Wolf joins you next.
In a blink of an eye, today's fast-turning tides can bring in the unexpected. At PineBridge Investments, we're built to harness these waves, whether it's the digital revolution, climate-driven change, or a pandemic. That's why we focus on areas of the market where our high-conviction approach can add the most value, and why our team of approximately 200 investment professionals in 21 offices worldwide ventures deeper and farther to decode hidden dynamics and uncover the best ideas now and into the future. Stay ahead in a changing world with active, high-conviction investing by PineBridge Investments.
So welcome back to our discussion, the Digital Boardroom, and I'm Martin Wolf, and it's my great pleasure to introduce and moderate this discussion of the world economy, where we are and where we might be heading. We have four very distinguished panelists. They are Laurence Boone, who has participated in these sessions before, who is chief economist at the OECD, and Carmen Reinhart, who is now chief economist at the World Bank, and Bill Dudley, whom I've first got to know when you were at Goldman Sachs, and was, of course, president of the New York Fed for many years, which is, I think, the second most important position in the Federal Reserve System, and more important than the vice chairman's. And finally, Markus Schomer, who is the chief economist of PineBridge. So I'm going to start, if I may, with a discussion of where we are in the world economy after not quite a year of COVID-19. It seems amazing that it's not even a year, but it has clearly upended the entire world economy. We're now, there's sort of a burst of optimism this week about vaccines and the possibility of vaccines, but huge challenges ahead. So, Laurence, if I could start with you, from your perspective, where are we? And in particular, if you sort of compare with our view a few months ago, do things look better or worse than we might have expected after the first 5 months or so of the crisis?
Hi, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everybody. As you meant, I would like to be a little more optimistic because everybody got so much hope with the vaccine. But I think compare where we thought we would be about 6 months ago when the OECD published its June economic outlook. We had two scenarios, if you remember. One was a single hit scenario, and the other one, which we said would be equally probable because we know was a second hit, two-hit scenario. And we're really starting to be into this second wave. And that has several implications. So let me start first. We did assume at the time that given all the money that was poured into research for vaccine or treatment, something would likely happen fairly quickly, like at about this time or next year. But the time to manufacture and deploy the vaccine and get everybody into it meant that this wouldn't have an impact on the economic outlook before possibly 2022, except for a little burst of confidence. So by this, in the meantime, we will have to live with a two-speed economy across countries, across the world, within countries, and across people and within and for people. So let me look at within economy. We have two types of sectors. We have those that can actually function nearly normally because we've learned from the wave, and you have about 20% of each economy related to leisure, travel, tourism that cannot operate properly, and that will continue. And we then have two-speed world with the countries that did manage well the crisis from a health and economic point of view, and they're mostly in Asia, and they will continue to do that. We can see that they're recovering more quickly, and then at the opposite, you have those who were really taken by surprise, even for the second wave. And then we run the risk of having a two-speed economy for people, with those like us on this chat who can work from home, as you all can see here, and who can continue and sometimes are even more productive, and those that cannot absolutely do that. And I'm also thinking about the kids missing school, which has, as you know, very long time effect. So that I think where we are, it's not a catastrophe. There's been huge policy support, both monetary and fiscal. But when we look ahead, we will still need that well targeted for at least another year.
So, Carmen, if I may turn to you, I'd be very interested in your perspective on how things look, again, particularly compared with about 6 months ago. And I'd be very interested, especially in how you view the situation in emerging and developing countries. Obviously, a very large part of the world economy. And in this, I've put to one side China, which is obviously sui generis and in a way Laurence has just discussed. So what is your perspective? How bad do things look? I've just been looking at some figures, and I was struck that at the top of the list of countries with very high mortality rates from COVID-19 are many South American countries. So that's particularly striking. So how do you perceive what's going on?
It's pretty devastating in many dimensions. Not just the economic dimension, but also the social dimension as well. So big takeaways. Martin, as you know, we've had these conversations. I was not particularly optimistic. I was not in the group looking for that V shape, which certainly, the point that rebound is not to be confused with recovery. And I think for these countries, recovery, really meaning getting back to your pre-crisis level of per capita income, is going to be a very slow process, a multi-year process. I would highlight that in 1990, 58% of the countries, developing and emerging market countries, had lower incomes than in 1980. I'm not suggesting, that we're heading in that direction, but that's a real danger. And it's the social fabric, as you mentioned. Latin America has been very badly hit. But apart from the fairly well documented economic downturns, there's the issue of poverty spikes. I mean, really big poverty spikes. In the World Bank's most recent report on poverty and shared prosperity, what you basically see is the first global spike in more than 20 years. And at the social level, what you're seeing is new entrants into poverty, women and children being particularly hard hit. And some of the poorest countries, this is also because of, migratory effects being disrupted, transportation issues have arisen. There's also food crises. So it's a very stark picture. And, we have to consider that for many of the poorest countries, about half of them right now are either in a debt crisis or quickly approaching one. So the issue of, I bring this up because the issue of having access and the capacity to do sustained stimulus, whether it's fiscal or monetary, is limited to non-existent. So, as the devastation caused by the crisis, the health crisis lingers, their capacity to deliver is very much diminished. And you're talking about also in many countries, and this is true also in some of the middle income countries, very much true in large tracts of Latin America. The informal sector is very large. And so the issue of a social safety net is limited or at worst non-existent. So it's a very grave situation. And, to conclude, I think, when we look at 2008, 2009, we say, oh, the global financial crisis. Global financial crisis was a crisis in 11 advanced economies that had big Lehman moment effects on, global markets for a short period, but nothing lasting and deep like COVID.
Yeah, I think that's very important. This is very clear on many dimensions. This is a much more significant economic crisis, let alone the health crisis from a worldwide point of view than the financial crisis was. So let me turn to you, Bill. Actually, I'd be rather interested in your perspective, since we raised it, on how this, in terms of its economic aspects, compares with the financial crisis. But I'd be particularly interested in your perspective on how the monetary policy makers have responded. Obviously, principally those with monetary policy room for maneuver, which is important, and obviously the Fed is the most significant. So, how would you grade them, and how would you compare their response to this crisis and the crisis itself to the one back in 2008?
So let me just start with just assessing the U.S. economy where we are. Basically, we bounced, I think, faster back in the summer and the fall than people expected. So if you look at how the economy is doing relative to the Fed's forecasts that they made mid-year, economy's done somewhat better than expected, really due to two factors: tremendous amount of fiscal stimulus and reopening. And if you look at the data, it's still pretty good, but that's looking in the rear view mirror. We're about to see a very sharp slowdown in U.S. economic activity due to two factors. Number one, the pandemic is surging, and this is going to lead to more social distancing, more shutdowns. And so you're going to get the exact reverse of the reopening benefits that you got earlier. And second, policy stimulus. We're sort of at the end of policy stimulus, meaningful policy stimulus for the time being. Monetary policy has done a tremendous job in terms of supporting the economy, cutting interest rates to zero, buying long-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, backstopping a wide variety of financial markets, having a very strong commitment to keeping interest rates low for long. And so we have 10-year treasury note yields at 90 basis points. Financial conditions in the United States are very accommodative. So the Fed has done, a good job in providing stimulus to the economy. You can actually see that in terms of the interest rate sensitive sectors. The housing sector and the auto sector, which are sensitive to interest rates, have done quite well. The problem we have on the policy front from the Fed's perspective is they could do more, but even if they did more, it really wouldn't have much further consequence in terms of economic activity. So it's not so much that they're out of ammunition. The problem is that the ammunition they have, if they used it, would not change the trajectory of the economy very much. The second problem is fiscal. We had a huge amount of fiscal stimulus in the spring and summer, and you saw that in the savings rate in the United States jumped up very dramatically. We fell off the fiscal cliff at the end of July. We haven't yet experienced the fall because the fiscal stimulus was so large, and you also got the benefits of the reopening. But the longer we go deeper and deeper into the pandemic, away from that fiscal stimulus, I think you're going to start to see much more meaningful impacts on economic activity going forward. And with the election, the prospects for a sizable fiscal stimulus package, I think, before inauguration has dropped. And I think that's dropped for two reasons. One, obviously, the Trump administration probably doesn't want to do any great favors to the incoming Biden administration. And two, we have these two Senate races in Georgia that are going to have a lot to do with who actually controls the Senate. And it's really hard to imagine that politics are going to be set aside to do a big fiscal package to arrive quickly with those political considerations in place. So I think my own view is we're in a pretty tough place right now. Economy is going to be slowing very sharply. I wouldn't rule out a double dip if the pandemic continues to worsen. And monetary policy can't do very much. That's why Chairman Powell and others at the Fed have been talking about the need for more fiscal stimulus. They're not going to admit that they're out of ammunition, but they're definitely, they understand that what they can do from here is very, very marginal because of what they've already accomplished to date.
Well, you all three in different ways have been projecting pretty grim picture for 2021. Economically, politically, pretty well across the world, with possibly the exception of China and a few other East Asian countries. Markus, how far do you concur with this view? And perhaps you could cheer us up a bit and say that things won't be so bad, and before we get to the longer term and some of the other issues this raises.
Yeah, let's see whether I can find one or two more positives. I don't disagree with most of what's been said before. Maybe on the margin, I would probably argue that, for example, you mentioned the positive news on the vaccine front. I think the fact that we always knew there will be a vaccine, but now the vaccine is getting really close. I think that very fact will make it much less likely that we see widespread shutdowns, for example, in the US. I think the vaccine news came a little bit too late for Europe, but also, frankly, the crisis in Europe is much, much worse compared to what we're seeing in the US. We get bombarded with our infection numbers all the time on TV here in the US, but the numbers in Europe are 3 times as bad as they are over here. So the shutdowns there maybe were more necessary than they would be over here. But the vaccine news, I think, makes these shutdowns much less likely. So I probably don't share the view that Bill Dudley just laid out, that we may see a double-dip recession in the US. Europe, maybe, if the shutdown is extended, but I doubt we get there in the US. You can also think about a shutdown is really a state decision. It's not so much a government decision. First of all, on the government level, on the federal government level, we have a vacuum of power right now. The outgoing Trump administration surely is not going to shut it down, and the incoming Biden administration doesn't have the levels of power yet anyway. And I think most of the states where the pandemic is raging right now won't shut it down. I think that we've seen over the last couple of weeks already. So I'm not so worried about the shutdown. I'm more worried about another aspect that Bill talked about, and that's the policy support. It's true the fiscal stimulus package that the House passed several months ago has still not gotten through the Senate or the White House. And by the middle of December, the first people who started losing jobs in the millions when the pandemic hit the economy in March, the first of that cohort will start to lose all income support. And that's a problem. If we let that run for 6, 7, 8 weeks, then there will be millions of people who suddenly have no money to buy food, no money to pay the rent. And we will see that in the economy. We'll see that in the economic numbers. That is more the reason I'm a little bit more concerned about the economy and the outlook for the US at the beginning of next year. And on the monetary policy side, maybe lastly, it's true, I agree that the Fed doesn't have a lot of tools left that could provide a significant jolt to the economy. That's absolutely true. It's a fiscal policy story, not a monetary policy story. But why are we not doing what still can be done? Why are 10-year bond yields at 90 basis points and not at 0, where they are in Europe right now? Why is the Fed not stepping in, at least maintaining bond yields at a very low level? Why would the Fed allow bond yields to rise? That to me is very inconsistent and shows that the policy coordination in monetary and fiscal policy, at least in the US, is not really working as smoothly as it could.
Can I just follow up on that before I go to the other parts of the world with you, Bill? So the two questions that arise, I think, which are very, very important here. One is, could indeed the monetary authorities do significantly more? Or would you take the view, well, even lowering the bond yield to 0 wouldn't really make any difference? It's sort of, you would be shooting, but you'd be really shooting blanks. And the second question, which is, I suppose, since you're no longer the Fed, you can comment on. I mean, I sort of start from the assumption that if the Senate remains in Republican hands, they will be absolutely determined to give Mr. Biden nothing, just 0. And therefore, there will be no more fiscal stimulus. What they want is a disastrous economy, as disastrous as possible, which they will blame on Mr. Biden. And this is not a new play. We've seen it before. Isn't that the plausible bet about the future of policy in the US? And in that case, you would in sense be agreeing that even if the pandemic isn't going to, the pandemic is not going to get worse, the economic response is going to get worse, or at least not get any better, and the economic prospects could then be really quite grim.
Well, turning first to the issue of could the Fed do more? The Fed could do more. I mean, they're not out of tools. They could do yield curve control where they peg Treasury yields at a lower level. But I think the point is that even if you manage to reduce long-term bond yields by 50 basis points, it just wouldn't have that much effect on real economic activity because you already have a lot of buoyancy in the interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy. Nobody in the US economy is suffering because the cost of credit is not available or is too high unless you're just not credit worthy. So I think that the Fed could do more, but I just don't think it would have that much consequence at this point. In terms of whether the Republicans will, have a scorched earth policy with the Biden administration, I think that depends on, who gets blamed. If the Republicans, just say we're not going to do anything to support the economy, as the economy is doing very, very poorly, then they'll get some of that blame. And I think, they are vulnerable because the pandemic could have been addressed much better in the U.S. By the current administration. We did not pursue social distancing, mask wearing to the degree that we could have. So we could have had either less COVID, better economy, or the same amount of COVID. We didn't optimize the trade-off in terms of shutdowns to economic activity because we didn't do a very good job in terms of mask wearing and social distancing. So, I think the Republican record on the pandemic is not going to be viewed by most people in the country as particularly sterling. And, I understand that Europe is in a worse position than the US right now, but the US situation is worsening very, very rapidly. there is a website that calculates the rate of reinfection. If I have COVID, how many people do I pass COVID on to? And for 48 out of the 50 US states, that reinfection rate is more than 1. So we're still in exponential acceleration of COVID in the United States. And given the reluctance to shut down again, and the reluctance of some people to social distance, not clear what breaks that dynamic of continued acceleration in COVID in the near term.
Laurence, if I may, I'd like to follow up on, at the moment, just focus on Europe, where you are, and the other sort of big developed economy. As Markus pointed out, and you pointed out, there's a colossal second wave now across Europe. Things look rather good in the summer, and everybody went to party. And one friend of mine said they all went to party in the Mediterranean, and where there was quite a lot of it around, and they spread it everywhere and brought it back home into Northern Europe, even to Germany. So what are the implications? And as a result, obviously there are lockdowns and voluntary social distancing, and the economic implications of all this look pretty bad. And your second scenario, as you repeat, the double hit scenario, was pretty grim. So flesh out a little bit what you think this is going to mean for the European economy. And does it mean they're going to have to reconsider their policy response? In the early stages, one thought, well, the fiscal response is rather good this time. And the ECB has been much more responsive than it was last time. But given what's now going on, is it nearly enough?
So I think so there are two questions, and I'll start with the first one that you asked. Actually, I don't know how to gauge the European situation compared with the US, because the situation is very different across US states. It's actually quite different in Europe. So it's true there is this second wave, but it's not managed in exactly the same way. If I'm over-simplistic, the only thing we know to do against this virus at the moment is physical distancing, and it's tracing to isolate people and break transmission channels, right? And then you can contain it, and when it becomes too big, then your hospital capacity is the limit. Every single European country is quite different in their capacity to respect social distancing, to do tracing and isolating, and in their healthcare capacity. What we are seeing is therefore a very different level of restrictions to mobility across Europe. But everybody starts being a little overwhelmed. Now, what does that mean in terms of policy? As I said before, I think there's a lot of better management in terms of sectors. People have learned to telework, they learn to function, but we still have sectors. So fiscal policy, and Europe and Commissioner Gentiloni yesterday called for even more fiscal support, right, for not putting the rules back. So we will need more fiscal policy, and we will need it very targeted to people who are in these sectors, because as Carmen pointed out, the minute you reopen, there's a very strong rebound if the people are still attached to their job. Obviously, if they've been laid off, then it takes time to recruit and so on. So I think we're going to see a little slowdown in activity, probably by no means the same size of what we have seen before, but potentially more over the medium term, because that's happening on a weaker economy with weaker firms in some instances, which is why the fiscal response needs to be super strong. Now, how can this fiscal response be super strong? And I think that's where I will answer your question. It has a lot to do with monetary policy. I don't think the question today is whether monetary policy has ammunition or not. Monetary policy has, as Bill reminded us, it can go all the way through yield curve control using forward guidance. But more than that, monetary policy is what is enabling fiscal policy. as long as central banks do commit to actually keep in place the condition for keeping rates low along the curve, then the governments will be able to actually provide the fiscal support that needs to be. And in a way, it's super interesting because that means that it is the central banks that are actually in a position to, to decide when the money is going to places that are not productive in the short or medium term. So it's, I think it's the very powerful combination of these two agents that can keep our economies afloat. It seems to me Europe has learned from the past mistake. We're not talking about fiscal austerity. As soon as there is a rebound, there's a huge commitment from the ECB on your very platform yesterday. And this, looking forward, can actually make a huge difference compared to what happened in the financial crisis.
And obviously that's particularly important in Europe, where each country doesn't have their own central bank, and they have a fairly credible collective one. And if it stands behind all the governments, then the governments can do fiscal policy. And if it doesn't, they can't, which has been politically controversial, but it's clearly what the ECB is currently committed to. And I'll come to that. Markus may have something he wants to say about that. Well, let's come to that later. I'd like to talk to you, Carmen, a little bit more about the situation of emerging and developing countries, because you painted a really grim picture. And after all, this applies, if we leave aside China and the developed countries, it still applies to something like 70% of the world's population. So is the conclusion we should reach from this that the response at the global level of the countries that do have capacity, fiscal and monetary capacity, to the plight of the emerging and developing world in the pandemic has been grossly inadequate? And what is the implications of that for them? Because after all, a pandemic is a global phenomenon. And if it's not controlled everywhere, then it's more difficult to, not impossible, but more difficult to control anywhere. So what do you think we ought to be doing that we're not doing to help developing and emerging countries through, and to avoid this nightmare possibility of a sort of 10-year legacy of this?
So that's a critical question, Martin, but I do want to hit on one issue that I think so far has been missed in the discussion. We've talked about vaccines, we've talked about monetary stimulus, we've talked about fiscal stimulus, but one part that we haven't talked about, and this applies to the US, it applies to the OECD, and it applies to emerging markets, and even a lot of the low income, is the kind of stimulus that's come from banking forbearance. And the fact that we've had, ample, really, and we see this in middle income countries, we've seen this, a big response to deal with households that have lost their jobs and firms that have no access to working capital or that are temporarily shut down, is basically put in suspension. This actually connects to your question at the international level, because this is the domestic parallel of the DSSI, of the debt suspension, debt service suspension initiative. And I have to wonder, we've discussed here what happens, what are the question marks when the fiscal firepower begins to wane and so on. What happens when the grace periods come to an end? And one issue, Martin, that I want to put on the table, not right now, but I want to put it on the table, is the issue of financial fragility, because this is also, again, it cuts across advanced and emerging markets. And speaking of temporary forbearance, that brings me to what international community has done. In May, the introduction of the debt suspension initiative, the DSSI, was a way of saying, okay, temporarily, whatever you're spending and allocating towards debt servicing, reoriented to emergency COVID-related relief. This is for an initiative for the poorest countries. It's a step in the right direction, but it's had its important limitations in real time. Private sector participation never materialized. So the amounts that were saved, even temporarily, from debt repayment and were able to be deployed to the emergency was much more limited than we had hoped. China's participation, they're the largest creditor to many of the poorest countries, was more limited than what had been hoped for. But, you know, where I think the policy response has been quite forceful is we're seeing, you know, we've seen record amounts of lending coming out of the IMF, the World Bank, the multilaterals, and this has been by and large front-loaded relative to most programs, fairly fast disbursement. So I think, you know, that part of the financial architecture, if you will, has worked well. But looking ahead, of course, you know, neither of these things are sustainable. They are, you know, emergency measures. So to avoid, you know, to conclude on the question that you posed, what can we do to avoid a replay of that lost decade from 80 to 90 that I alluded to also earlier? We have to get on the ball on debt restructuring and debt reduction. And, you know, with creditors, we know from history it's pulling teeth. So the question of getting there rapidly would be a way not of necessarily assuring, but a really giant step towards, you know, faster reestablishment of, you know, capital market access, of just trade finance, and of growth in general. So that's a little bit of what is the next big step, debt restructuring.
So, Markus, I'd like to follow on that, though. Well, perhaps two areas you might like to comment. I'd be interested in your views on Europe and where that might end. But I think, Carmen, I was going to go into the sort of the next stages, and there seem to be two interesting aspects of this. There are many, but if you're looking at the economy as a whole, one is financial fragility. What is going to happen in the financial sector? And I'd like both you and Bill to comment on that. And the other, which I'd like all of you to look at, is the sort of longer term scarring issues, which Carmen has already touched upon, you know, beyond next year. Let's assume that the pandemic itself begins to be brought under control, but it's been an enormous shock. What is it going to leave? Where is it going to leave the world economy in terms of changes in the structure of economies, changes in growth, changes in levels of real income? You know, 5 years from now, we're going to look back and say, well, we had this terrible shock, but we can't see any sign of it anymore. Thank God it's all over. Or are we going to be looking back and saying, actually, this changed a lot, and some of it was good and some of it was really disastrous? So these are things I'd like to sort of go through. Go ahead. So just to give you an indication where I'd want to go in the last few minutes. Anyway, Markus, how do you see these issues?
Well, let me make three comments then on those three issues you mentioned. First of all, on Europe, I'm more concerned about the politics in Europe. Yes, we hope that we won't relive the fiscal policy errors from the previous business cycle, but I'm not so sure that we won't. Right now, everything looks fine. We had this beautiful package in September, but I can imagine in 2022, at the end of 2021 and in early 2022, we have two key elections in Europe, in Germany and in France, and they could be much more impactful on the world than what we're just seeing in the US. If we get the wrong government in power in Germany and in France, we could see a severe Euro crisis, which is sort of has been my real doomsday scenario for quite a while, and nothing so far has pushed that probability any lower. In fact, the economic crisis and the COVID crisis, I think, raises the chances that we will see more populist governments being elected in Europe. Even though maybe in the US we see the pressure from that side is receding, I think in Europe that pressure will still increasing. So I'm still worried about Europe until we get through, in particular, the French elections. Quite interesting what Carmen Reinhart was talking about in terms of debt relief for especially the poorest countries. I think we do have a template for that, really, don't we? The way the Europeans addressed a very similar crisis in the last business cycle. I think what we need to do is utilize the global institutions, in particular probably the IMF, maybe not so much the World Bank, but more the IMF, to do essentially what the ECB did. Let's push the moral hazard issue to the side. If it wasn't about the moral hazard, then the IMF should buy up as much of the debt as possible and finance it at very low interest rates, which we can do right now in financial markets. I think that would be probably one way to utilize the infrastructure that we have, the global financial infrastructure, to help and relieve some of the debt pressure on at least the poorest countries. And then finally, on the financial fragility, I'm actually not so worried about financial fragility itself, because central banks have proven that they're willing to step in and become buyers of last resort. You know, we used to talk about central banks being lenders of last resort when it's all about the banking system, but now it's about financial markets in general. And central banks have clearly shown their willingness to step in and prevent asset prices from declining and adding on a financial crisis to an already pretty severe economic crisis. So I think, especially myself working in the financial markets, there's a great sense that there's a big central bank put in all markets. If we see dislocations and severe declines in asset prices, central banks will step in and prevent that from happening. That really is their role in the kind of asset-dominated world that we're living in right now.
So, Bill, they're buyers of last resort. They're assuming presumably substantial risk on the balance sheet. Who cares? They used to care, but they don't. And therefore, in central banks, we trust. And at least in the major economies where they're prepared to buy up all this stuff, junk or not, financial fragility is no longer a big issue, though it might be elsewhere. How do you respond to that?
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. I think, the lessons of the pandemic to date are that the reforms that we made to the core banking system have worked. In other words, requiring more liquidity, more capital, higher quality capital, stress tests. People have not lost confidence in the core banking system. And that's really important. That's really why we had what happened in the fall of 2008. There was essentially a loss of trust in the banking system. We don't have that this time, and I don't think we're going to get there because the banks are much stronger. The problem I think we have is, especially in the United States, the non-bank financial system still has got a lot of structural issues that haven't been successfully addressed. Were not successfully addressed by the Dodd-Frank Act. So the Federal Reserve had to intervene again to help the money market funds. They had to intervene again to backstop the commercial paper market. They had to intervene again to backstop the asset-backed securities market. That all tells you that there's still, an inability in the U.S. regulatory setup to really get their arms around financial stability risk outside of the core banking system. And I think the failure here is the Financial Stability Oversight Council that was supposed to be set up to address that issue. And as we know, that has essentially, it's I guess it's nominally still in business, but the four companies that were designated as systemic and subject to potential regulation have been de-designated. And the FSOC, as far as I'm aware, has been very inactive in terms of worrying about financial stability risk in the non-bank financial system. The last issue we have in the United States is that some of the core regulators of our financial system, the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Corp, and the Securities Exchange Commission, don't have an explicit financial stability mandate. So they're responsible in some sense, but they don't actually internalize that because that's not really the mandate that's been given them from Congress. So we have a lot of work to do in the U.S. In terms of fixing the non-bank financial part of the equation. And that's important because in the US, the banking system is actually a pretty small fraction of the entire financial system.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to ask a couple of them, very quick answers to one of you, and then the sort of this last question of the longer term. Carmen, a couple of the questions are about vaccine nationalism. The vaccine is clearly going to be rolled out in China, where they don't seem to have many cases, East Asia, the rich countries of East Asia, Australasia, and the developed world. And they bought it all up. What are the implications of that for the plight of the countries you're mainly concerned with? Does that, given that they're relatively young populations, does that not matter? In some countries, as we said, in Latin America, there's huge incidence of the disease. So how big a problem is vaccine nationalism from your perspective?
It's a very big problem, and the World Bank has a major initiative on that front, precisely because of the fear that the poorest countries are the last in the queue, and that there's issues in terms of access, because of cost, access, at what time, and so the World Bank is partnering, a major initiative to help countries, help national authorities access vaccines. The targets are, again, this is, resources are not infinite, but the targets are also, high risk, starting out the process with high risk, health workers. But it is precisely in the anticipation that, the competition for vaccine is going to mean, big relative price hikes, and then, being last on the queue. On that score, Martin, but, on the very long-term issues, I'll be super quick, but I don't think, when I said lasting poverty and social issues, I think what we're starting to get from the people that work on health-related issues and nutritional issues and educational issues at the bank is that the lasting scars also involve, a heavy hit towards human capital. That, we haven't brought that issue forward in this discussion, but the human capital hit in terms of education and health is likely to be in this, in the developing country context, major. So
that's a very good concluding point from you. And Laurence, I'd just like to ask you one question, then your sort of longer term view, but we have to be very brief. So public debt in OECD countries is sort of at recordish levels, but debt is incredibly cheap. So should we worry about it at all or not? And then in the longer term, would your bet be that this is sort of a permanent hit to growth and incomes in the countries of the OECD? Or is actually, even though it's a terrible shock, transitory? So I'm afraid you've only got a couple of minutes to cover those two questions, but I'm sure you can manage it.
Okay, I'll take 10 seconds to say one thing to an answer there and close Europe. It's 12 years, I think, that some in financial market have thought that Europe was collapsed, and it's still there, alive and kicking, and it even moved further with the recovery funds. So I think for the doom spirit that we can have in the future of Europe, that's a point. One thing as well is we're all in this together. Carmen mentioned at the beginning that the great financial crisis was a handful of countries or two handful of countries. This one is very much a global crisis, and we perhaps have a unique chance of restoring multilateralism, right? We need a London moment for this crisis, not only for fiscal policy, as Carmen was alluded, not only for the vaccine, as we talked, but also, I think, for restoring trade to make sure that there's a free flow of medical drugs and equipments. Now, you asked me the question about this sort of race to the trillion from public money that's increasing debt. I think what we fear the most at the OECD is that post-COVID or a few years into COVID, the name of this crisis will be the great inequality, not only because it's affecting the most vulnerable workers, but also because of what was said about education. And there as well, it's affecting the most vulnerable kids, the one with their social economic background that is not good. Those kids don't have computers, they don't have phone, they cannot work from home. So the question that will be asked for the debt is, what have you done with this money? Have you spent it wisely? And I think that's what we now must focus on, put the money where it's needed, and it's needed in education, especially for the kids that are from deprived background. It's needed in the digital economy. We need to equip schools, we need to equip teachers, we need to equip rural areas, and more than important, I think we need to equip SMEs, because SMEs are the one that makes the dynamic of employment. And that's where we want things to go ahead and to go fast. And the last point is, I think we've missed the chance in the last crisis of really addressing climate change and investment there. Investment is good not only because it raises demand today, but because it's paving the way for the type of growth we will have tomorrow. And I don't really think that we can afford today to miss this opportunity, in part because people will ask, again, what have you done with this money? So to conclude, I would say the higher debt level will not be an issue if this money has been spent where it's going to lift growth and growth for everybody. Thanks.
So we've got 2 minutes and 40 seconds. So Bill, in 1 minute, long-term scarring as you see it in the US and perhaps in the world, or essentially transitory shock?
I mean, I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I mean, obviously there'll be some scarring. I mean, businesses will go out of business, it will fail, and especially in leisure and hospitality. People will come out of the crisis with a lot more debt, and so balance sheets will be hurt, and that'll have some lasting impact. But we've never gone through anything quite like this since 1918. So I think we want to be pretty cautious about trying to evaluate how much scarring there's going to be versus we have a nice, smooth, easy recovery. I think it's going to take a while to get back to where we were. I don't think it's going to be a quick and easy journey. But that said, if we get the pandemic under control, life will go back to something that looks a little bit like normal relatively, probably relatively quickly.
And Markus, I'm going to ask you a slightly different final question, but if somebody asked me this, because unless you've got radically different views on what we've heard, what is the next shock that everybody should worry about?
Wow. Well, apart from the unknown unknowns, like COVID, I guess was, I think to me the next shock to the system could be the future of the EU and the euro. Not looking at anything that could sort of cyclically move us into another crisis. The really shock moment, I think, is if the political trends in Europe go wrong and we get the wrong government in Germany, as I said, the wrong government in France. I think there is a potential that all the tension that still exists in Europe, that's covered over right now by a little bit of fiscal solidarity, which I don't think will last, that these tensions will reemerge in an environment where there's a lot more populism already in Europe today, where that creates the forces and intensifies the forces that could pull the EU and pull the euro apart. So that to me is a shock that's already out there on the horizon. We can see the potential. The probability may be low, but the potential is there. So that's something that I'm focusing on over the next few years to see whether that could become the next shock or whether it's just a doomsday scenario that we can put back onto the shelf.
I know that Laurence will disagree on that one, so we don't need to go into that one. I just say, I think it's been a very, very rich discussion. The only thing that I think we haven't focused on enough, but perhaps we couldn't, is what all this has done to US-China relations and the world order from that point of view. But that's a big second issue. What is very, very clear, we're in the midst of a massive event with multiple ramifications within our societies and among our countries, between our countries. We don't really know how it will end, but it doesn't seem to me, at least, that it will definitely end next year. It might be changing, but it's likely to be with us. So this is a very big story which isn't over. And thank you very much to the panel. I think it's been an excellent discussion and given us even more reasons to worry about than at the beginning, but at the same time, some things that have gone really quite well. Thank you very much to everybody. And I wish the participants a pleasure for the future the rest of the digital boardroom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.